As time progresses, so does the preference of people. What we'll see as we examine the classical era is that the age of the Baroque era came to an abrupt end. Remember, in the Baroque era, people valued things that were embellished and ornamented. In the classical era, we'll find something starkly different. Our purpose for today's lesson is to identify distinguishing characteristics of music from the classical era. To do so, we'll examine what was happening in society and technology so that we can determine how that might have impacted musical development. Let's begin by considering this question. What does the term classical music mean? In our area, there's a classical music radio station. It plays classical music all the time. Do they mean that they're only playing music from 1750 to 1820? In fact, that term has been associated with any type of music involving a symphony orchestra. In reality, for our purposes today, the classical era is the music we're referring to. That was a short time in music historical development, and we need to remember that that is something significantly different than all orchestral music throughout history. In the classical era, there were two important developments. One being the power of people, all people. Second, being the rise of the middle class. People were getting fed up with a two-class social structure in which a tiny group of rich people at the top of the social scale held power over a vast number of poor people at the bottom, people with virtually no rights and no way to climb out of their poverty. We investigated a bit of this when we discovered in the Baroque era that wealth was centered on nobility and on the aristocracy, which meant that most people who would be middle-class people in today's society had very little comfort and very little wealth. Power was slowly changing hands from the aristocracy to the growing middle class. This middle class came about partly through the Industrial Revolution, which brought a sudden, massive increase in the number of jobs available in mines, factories, and on the railroads. It was an age of invention, from Watt's steam engine to the hot air balloon and carbonated soda. So during this time, the people who used to serve wealthy people, kings and queens and emperors, these people were now needed to work in the mines and the factories and the railroads. And because of the influence of other developments technologically, these people also began to earn time to be entertained and time to relax. People began to believe in the power of human reason to solve social problems, to correct unjust behavior, and to make their lives better. Ultimately, the aristocracy loses its influence, and people begin to believe that within themselves, they have the power to improve their situations. A few important inventions and instances from the classical era. In 1751, right as the Baroque era ended, Benjamin Franklin determines that lightning is electrical. In 1769, the steam engine is patented. Remember, in the Baroque era, the steam engine was invented. Now it's moving along quite a bit and becoming a bit more effective and efficient. In 1776, the American Declaration of Independence was signed. That's important for our study because America has not yet developed into a strong country that we know it to be today. In 1783, the hot air balloon was invented. In 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as President of the United States. And in 1810, Frederick Koenig invented the steam-driven printing press. So you see that relationship of steam being used to power inventions. The printing press is important because that means that you can print books and papers and you can get information out to people, which also in turn creates a need for education so that everyone has an opportunity to learn to read. And because there was more time for freedom and entertainment, coffee drinking becomes a popular part of social life. Gambling, lotteries, card playing, chess, checkers, dominoes, and billiards, pool, all entertain people. So some of those things we can relate to quite a bit, but we might not have thought that in 1775 people were also enjoying playing card games. The United States of America is a developing country at this point in history. What does that mean for its influence on musical development? In short, what it means is there is no development yet musically in the United States. I bring this question up to allow us to consider that Europe was the center of the development of music, Western music. America was not yet a part of that. So imagine what might happen as the United States of America becomes a developed country. Fashion. We enjoy talking about the fashion of the Baroque era. Remember I said there were some stark changes. Fashion is one of those. The classical period developed new fashions, especially for women. During the daytime, women usually wore long, flowy dresses with a matching bonnet and gloves. In the evenings, women wore large hoop skirts with a petticoat underneath. These skirts were usually elaborately patterned and decorated with fine silk. A corset bodice was worn at the top with a blouse that matched the skirt material. Women often wore bonnets and hats. Creams, mint green, and blue were popular colors. Clothing decorations were usually gold or red. Men wore long tail coats that were usually black with a top hat. They wore a white or cream shirt and cream pants. On their feet were black or camel knee-high leather boots, and leather gloves were worn to keep their hands warm. I know you guys are probably excited to hear that the men are no longer wearing heels with buckles and bows on their shoes. They've updated themselves to boots. White powdered wigs were often worn by children and adults. Powder kept hair clean from pests. Wigs were scented with lavender and orange to mask unpleasant smells. In the Baroque era, remember we talked about extreme hairstyles of women. In this era, the women have calmed down their hairstyles a bit, and now those wigs that were natural colors are white from the powder that are kept in the wigs. People from the time, on the right, you can see a comparison of what people in the Baroque era were more likely to wear. And on the left, you can see a painting representing people from the classical era. So there's some similarities, but one of the greatest differences in the simplicity of how women are dressed. What does this change in society and in people's preferences mean for art and architecture? What developed is a series of symmetrical and balanced styles influenced by the designs of ancient Greece. These dominated the work of artists and architects. Order was valued over the drama and extravagance of the Baroque era. Below you can see a picture of an ancient Greek structure. In the next several slides, we'll see how this similarity happened in the classical era. The word that we'll learn to focus on is simplicity. Pictures from the Baroque era. Remember, the buildings were added all kinds of ornamentations. And this is our first picture from a classical era building. Notice how much simpler the doors and windows are, and how symmetrical the building is. If we drew a line right down the center, you would notice that each side is almost identical. So when we look at this, we see something much simpler. And in the columns, you can see a reference to the classical Greek structure that we peeked at a few slides before. Another classical era building. And this one might be even more simplistic than the first one. So quite a difference in the style of architecture. What about art? This is a famous painting from the classical era. And our first look might not seem so different from Baroque paintings. When we add some guidelines on top of this painting, it's easy for us to see the symmetry and simplicity in this artwork. There are many bright colors to look at that can kind of distract our eyes, but a closer look suggests that the line of the building and the triangular shape at the top is very similar to the line that distinguishes the height of the characters in the painting. And then if we draw a line in the middle and compare both sides, you'll see that they are almost symmetrical in their use of characters and buildings. Even further down the painting, there's a woman in a red dress on the left and a green dress on the right. And you can see that their height is almost even. And then below them, there's another row of people looking at the painting. Their height is also very similar. So this artist has done a wonderful job of balance and symmetry in this work. This is perhaps one of the most famous paintings from the classical era. This is Napoleon Bonaparte. And again, if we add guidelines to our picture, we begin to see that there's just about as much of the horse and Napoleon in each square, but we also see the line in the very center running vertically. Almost makes it look as if he's balanced on like a carousel, with his hand pointing at the top and his foot above the horse's foot at the bottom. So that's how an artist established symmetry and balance. What did musicians do? What musicians did was simplify their work. When symmetry is considered in music, we just mean that you would hear the same thing on either side. So there is no contrast in the way there was in the Baroque era. The music is balanced, it is poised, restrained, and refined. The word I want you to remember is simple. The role of composers has also begun to change in this era. In Mozart's day, a musician was considered just another form of servant. You served your aristocratic master, who hired you to write and play music at his court or palace. Your job was on a par with the cooks, butlers, maids, and cleaning staff. What this means to us is that musicians were not respected at this time. It was not a job you would have encouraged your children to follow. They were just servants. Now read the second little bit with me. Composers and musicians were considered the servants of nobility. Beethoven's fiercely independent spirit challenged that thinking. Beethoven really helped to fuel an idea that a composer was a very important person, and that just as any other person, he should be treated well, and he should be respected. While composers continued to write music to please royalty, the growth of the middle class, along with developments in technology, allowed them the option to write more diverse music. Middle-class people now had time for entertainment, and many began learning to play instruments themselves. So a composer could write music for royalty and earn a great deal of money doing so, but they could also now focus on music for the middle class, sometimes very simple music, so that the middle class people had a chance to play great music as they were learning their instruments. One composer we'll focus on is Mozart. Mozart was always full of energy, often restless, and extremely hardworking. He loved games of all sorts. He knew many card tricks, and his other interests include billiards, bowling, charades, fencing, and horseback riding. He liked to keep dogs, cats, and birds as pets. So even though Mozart lived many years ago and was a composer, and probably quite different from you and I, we can see some similarities between ourselves in that paragraph. Mozart was a musical virtuoso, meaning he was a highly skilled musician even as a child. It was as though he could not be taught music because he already understood it. By the time he was 6 years old, he was traveling all around Europe to perform for royal families. Why is this music important today? Well, it's still great to listen to. Here's one that you're probably familiar with. But did you know that that was also used in DDR? So it's interesting to consider how people sample Mozart's music. By sampling, we mean that we borrow their melodies and incorporate them into more modern styles. This piece has not been made modern, but you've probably heard it before. Another selection from Mozart that you've probably heard. And a final selection by Mozart that is probably fairly familiar. Right, so those pieces are proof that the music Mozart wrote several hundred years ago are also very influential in our lives today because they lasted. Their interest in his work is very lasting. Our second composer focus for the classical era is Ludwig van Beethoven. A nobleman once talked during a performance. Beethoven stopped playing and declared, "For such pigs I do not play." He once famously poured red gravy over the head of a waiter. And despite his difficult behavior, Beethoven made friends easily. The ladies loved him. Beethoven was developing a new musical style all his own. Nearly everything he wrote had something new, sensational, or strange about it. And sadly, at only 28 years old, just before writing his very first symphony, Beethoven began to lose his hearing. The last 10 years of Beethoven's life, he heard nothing. Beethoven changes music in a way that people began to respect musicians and composers because he proved their value. A piece you're probably familiar with. Did you know that that piece was used in a hip-hop song not many years ago? Right, so an interesting use of Für Elise by Beethoven in a song I Can many years later by Nas. I bet you've heard this before. But did you know that it was used in kind of an old school children's movie about a dog?
Who tells what he wants to be called?
So an interesting use of Beethoven in modern world or modern society, movies and entertainment. A piece Beethoven wrote is probably one of the most popular melodies ever, and it's in this video clip. We'll hear just a portion of it. The music of Beethoven. In today's lesson, we learned that music of the classical era can be described as balanced and symmetrical. The word we are holding on to is simple. And that simplistic music is in comparison to the music we just learned about from the Baroque era, which was quite the opposite. It was anything but simple. So Baroque era music, our word we associate is fancy. Classical era music will say it is simple. Two famous composers of the classical era include Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Ludwig van Beethoven. Probably two composers you have heard of before you joined me in class. Very famous composers. Your assignment: read and respond to a brief text about classical era composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Check On-Course Classroom for assignment details. Remember, incomplete or late work will not receive full credit. Your best effort is expected.